Dear listeners, I'm your host, Adrian Matus, editor and review of Democracy, and I would like to welcome you to a new book presentation. Throughout these events, our aim is straightforward. We want to map the latest academic and cultural debates and to invite scholars to discuss their latest works. This week was a particularly busy one. Yesterday, we discussed the book Democracy's Double Helix, Participation, Equality and Revolution in Early Modern Europe, exploring the historical roots of modern democracy. In case you missed it, you can check the recorded version on our YouTube channel. Yesterday, the focus fell on Grammatic of Democracy. Now, today's event follows a different yet a very related line of inquiry, the visibility of knowledge, by asking ourselves who created knowledge, who disappears, and what mechanisms obscure, create, and select it. More specifically, we'll continue the discussion about history of science and medical practices. In December, we had the honor and pleasure to discuss with Irina Anastasa Matei and Amelia Bonia about their latest book, Negotiating Invisibility: Women, Science, and Medicine in the 20th Century. Our today's event strongly builds on that conversation. We're focusing on an extremely interesting book called Medical Women in the Japanese Empire: Sources and Critique, published by Routledge in 2025. We are truly honored to host all three of the editors, Hiro Fujimoro, Aya Homei, and Ellen Gardner Nakamura, along with one distinguished respondent, Amelia Bonia. Let me briefly introduce our guests. Hiro Fujimoro is assistant professor at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies, Heidelberg University in Germany. He works on the history of medicine in modern Japan from global and gender perspectives. He wrote several articles in Japanese and English, including Women, Missionaries, and Medical Professions. Aya Homei is reader in Japanese studies at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. She researches the history of medicine and science in modern Japan, focusing on population and reproduction. Her recent publication includes Science for Governing Japan's Population, published in 2023. Ellen Gardner Nakamura is associate professor of Asian Studies at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She specializes in the social history of medicine in the 19th century, Japan. Her most recent monograph is Japanese Medical Lives in Transformation, Contesting Modernity in the Late 19th Century, which was also published in 2025. Our discussant is Amelia Bonia, who is a lecturer in global history of science, technology, and medicine in the Center for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. Her current work examines the global entanglement of earth and environmental sciences in South and East Asia in the 20th century and the role of women. Her edited book, Negotiating Invisibility with Irina Anastasa Matei, featured in our previous event. This time she joins us as a discussant and respondent. Let me walk you a bit through the structure. First, our editors will introduce the book. This will take a good part of the first part of the event. Then our respondents will share their reflections, critique, and thoughts and comments. Afterwards, the editors will have the chance to respond and react. And finally, we'll open the floor to your questions in the chat section of our YouTube channel. So you can simply type your questions on our YouTube channel and I will gather them, address them to our editors. Our talk about medical women will begin with Aya Homei. Aya, you have the word.
Actually, we thought about the structure, and we decided that Hiro is going to start because, in fact, this was in a way kind of like his baby. So well, as much as us, but and
Yeah.
Hiro can explain this
Yeah. Yeah,
most
sure.
effectively. So I'm going to so Hiro is going to go first. I'm going to go next, and then I'll pass it over to Ellen. So yeah, over to you, Hiro.
Yeah, thank you so much. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me today. My name is Hiro Fujimoto. I'm a history of medicine and modern Japan, teaching at Heidelberg University in Germany. Today, I would like to introduce our edited volume, focusing on 3 points: the academic gap this book addresses, how this project came into being, and the composition of the editorial team and contributors. First, I will talk about the academic gap. This project brings together medical history and history of Imperial Japan. I was trained mainly as a medical historian in Japan. In that scholarly setting, medical history has often been written around male physicians. Even when women doctors appeared, the focus tended to fall on a very small number of exceptional figures, such as the first woman to obtain a medical license or the founder of a women's medical university. This approach made women's medical work appear rare and exceptional rather than structural. In contrast, in English language research of Imperial Japan, there is a strong body of scholarship that emphasizes women's agency. Women appear as workers, migrants, students, and professionals. However, fewer studies ask how that agency was connected to the expansion of the structure of the Japanese Empire itself. This book addresses that gap. We ask a simple but a central question. Within the framework of Imperial Japan, what kind of opportunities did women gain in order to become medical professionals, and what kinds of limits did they face? To answer this, we examine women from Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China, and we look across several professions: doctors, nurses, midwives, and nutritionists, rather than focusing on only one group. Second, I will explain how this project came into being. As I mentioned, my early training in Japan exposed me to a medical history that was still strongly centered on male physicians. During graduate school, I had the opportunity to study in the United States. There, I encountered approaches that treat gender as essential for understanding medicine and medical institutions. When I published my first monograph in 2021 in Japanese, I tried to include a gender perspective as much as possible. Through that work, I became convinced that I wanted to do something more systematic. I wanted to rethink Japanese medical history through women, not as an added topic, but as a core analytical lens. At the same time, I knew I could not do this well on my own. So I asked 2 scholars who had developed gender perspective in Japanese medical history earlier than I did, and who had worked in this field for many years: Ellen Nakamura and Aya Homei. Both of them kindly agreed. At the time, I had only recently completed my doctorate, and editing an English language volume was completely new to me. But Ellen and Aya guided the project with great care and experience. Because of them, this book became possible. So I'd like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to both of them for their generous support of an early career scholar. Third, I will talk about the team composition, both editors and contributors. Let me begin with the editors. Ellen Nakamura at the University of Auckland is a specialist in in early modern Japanese medical history and has also worked on Ogino Ginko, the first woman to obtain a medical license in modern Japan. Aya Homei at the University of Manchester studies reproduction and population from the Meiji period through the post-war era and has published widely on midwives and related medical professionals. Together, the three of us designed the overall structure of the volume. We then organized several online workshops during the COVID-19 pandemic and invited contributors. In selecting contributors, we paid close attention to balance. We aimed for diversity in career stage and in academic training. We wanted scholars who had been trained in different academic environments because that shapes research questions and methods. This was especially important to us because English language Japanese studies often highlight research from North America. The work is extremely valuable, but we also wanted to show that Japanese medical history is being actively studied in many parts of the world. For that reason, we made a conscious effort to include scholars working in different countries and scholarly traditions. In fact, even after the book was published, there were still contributors whom we had never met in person. But through repeated online meetings, we learned that serious and productive academic discussion is possible without physical travel. In the preface of the book, we refer to Claudia Goldin, the 2023 Nobel Prize winner in economic sciences. Her work reminds us that many researchers face limits on physical mobility and that gender often plays a role. Our volume was produced entirely through online collaboration, not only because of the pandemic, but also because we wanted to support a more inclusive academic practice. I would like to acknowledge Dorian, who is hosting today's event. I believe he shares a similar concern about access and public academic exchange, and I would like to express my respect for his work through platforms such as this YouTube series organized by Central European University Democracy Institute. I will stop here for now, and I look forward to discussing the book further during the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for very kind words and a very clear and structured introduction. You led us through a very straightforward and clear understanding of the main stakes of the book. I would like to ask the next editor to go and expand on the edited volume.
Okay, so so before I proceed with my part, I'd like to give my special thanks to Adrian for organizing this event, and to, of course, Amelia, who kindly suggested our book for this venue and agreed to be a respondent. So I hope our discussion lives up to expectations and generates as much discussion as it did when Amelia and Irina presented their edited volume, Negotiating Invisibility, which, as Adrian introduced, focuses on the history of women in science. So in my section, I'll focus on four things. So the volume's core argument, its main claims and theoretical stance, and its contributions. So let me start with the core argument of the book. So the book's central argument is that gender inequality in medicine in Japan today is not accidental, but historically produced. So its roots lie in the period when modern medicine developed alongside Japan's nation building and empire building processes, which span from the in the case of Japan, the mid 19th century to 1945. So these nation building and empire building processes shaped how medical knowledge became, how medical work became gendered. And with this volume, we wanted to argue that we can only understand the making of modern medicine by placing medical women at the center of the story. So from this argument, we make several claims. I think these can be roughly categorized into three. Well, I've actually categorized into three for this talk. So firstly, with this volume, we challenge a dominant tendency scholarship to focus mainly on male experts and the state, which Hiro has started to actually address. So instead of that, we highlight women clearly as central historical actors. And secondly, with this volume, we argue that women's medical histories appear invisible, largely because of the nature of the archive. And this is consistent with the argument which Amelia and Irina made in their volume. So women often had fewer opportunities to publish or record their experiences, so their voices survive in fragmented forms. Now, with this volume, we treat this fragmentation not just as a research challenge, but as historical evidence of structural inequality. And thirdly, by using a frame of the Japanese empire, we wanted the volume to show that standard national narratives miss key parts of the story. So once we follow medical women across the imperial space across Japan, Hokkaido, Okinawa, Taiwan, Korea, and China, the medical landscape looks different. So now I'll briefly explain the book's theoretical stance by drawing attention to the three key themes we developed for this volume. So the first is femininity as a double-edged sword. So by that we meant gender norms restricted women's careers, but also opened up opportunities when activities associated with women, such as childbirth, childcare, or domestic hygiene, these things became part of the medical landscape of modern Japan. The second theme is fringe and mobility. So Hiro started to talk about mobility, but so for this volume, we see fringe as not just geographic, but also as women's marginal positioning within professional hierarchies and medical knowledge systems. And equally, mobility, as we understand it, is not simply movement, but movement structured by imperial power, gender norms, and social inequality. So women, we try to describe that women often build careers in marginalized and underdeveloped spaces, and many moved across the empire for training or work. So these conditions could open up space for professional authority, but they also often reproduced new forms of exclusion, and at times they expose women to exploitation or in violence, particularly during wartime. So the third theme is kinship and family background. So in Japan had patriarchal systems during the period we observed. And in these patriarchal systems, so family support, particularly from male relatives, could be actually essential for women's education and careers. But with this volume, we also wanted to show cases where women built careers despite family opposition, or gain new forms of economic and social independence through medical work. So across all these themes, we wanted to emphasize intersectionality. We wanted to show how gender interacted with class, colonial hierarchy, region, and local social structures. And finally, in terms of contributions, Hiro, explained some of them, but I think there are three main ones. So related to what Hiro said, the first is about scholarly contribution. So with this volume, we recenter women as essential to the development of modern medicine and healthcare in the Japanese empire, not just as patients or targets of policy, but as workers, professionals, and so on. The second, as I saw it, is to do with methodological. So with this volume, we wanted to, model how historians can work with fragmented and uneven sources while still reading, women's voices critically. And a third, and this was particularly important for us, is pedagogical and linguistics. By translating sources from Japanese, Korean, and Chinese into English and pairing them with critical commentary. So this is a structure we had. We wanted the volume to make histories that are often invisible because of language barriers. So we wanted the volume to make them make accessible for English language research and teaching. So the goal is not only to contribute to scholarship, but also to expand what can be taught in English language classrooms about Japanese history, empire, and the history of medicine. So overall, with this volume, we argue that understanding modern medicine and gender inequality within it requires putting medical women at the center across the full geographic and political scope of the Japanese empire. So now I'll hand over to Ellen, who will walk us through the structure of the book and chapter sources. So off you go, Ellen.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much again for this opportunity to speak about our book today. So I'm going to briefly introduce some of the sources and outline the chapters in the book. So the chapters are basically in chronological order. The earliest piece is from 1886, and some of the later pieces deal with the wartime activities in the 1940s. Although some of these sources were not actually published until 1980 or 1990. Each chapter begins with an introductory essay that situates the source, and it's followed by an English translation. The first two chapters deal with the late 19th century. This was a time when both the medical profession and the process of nation building and empire building in modern Japan was being established. In chapter 1, Ayahome analyzes the government's unique attempt to spread modern midwifery in the 1880s and introduces a textbook, or sort of textbook, on modern midwifery. This book gives new insight into how knowledge and new knowledge and traditional vocabularies were integrated in quite creative ways. So it acknowledged what local midwives already knew, and at the same time made it easy for them to understand the new vocabularies. My own chapter discusses Ogino Ginko, who, as we talked about, became the first licensed female doctor of modern medicine in Japan. The translated document is an interview with Ogino, and she talks about the suffering of women who contracted sexually transmitted diseases. She tells the story of her own strong determination to become a doctor. But reading between the lines, we can also learn that there were many other doctors, cohorts along with her, who were also struggling to become doctors at the time. What's interesting about her is how she speaks about the strong criticism that she experienced in her journey to become a doctor, including members of her own family who made fun of her ambitions. The next two chapters by Akane Meguro and Nathan Hobson illuminate the rising status of professional women in medicine and healthcare, specifically women doctors and nutritionists. Meguro writes about Yoshioka Yayoi, who is perhaps one of Japan's most famous female doctors historically, and writes about her strategy to gain more acceptance of women in medicine. Instead of competing head-on with male physicians, she highlights the role that women could play through preventative medicine, through supplementary roles as home doctors in domestic and family medicine. The translated source in this chapter is an extract from Yoshioka's book of 1936. Hobson contributes a fascinating chapter dealing with Kondo Toshiko, as a high-profile nutritionist who worked as a public health official in Japanese factories and villages in the 1930s and 1940s. Extracts from her autobiography provide, in my opinion, amusing and touching insights into her strong personality, as well as the struggle to find a place for nutritionists in public health when this was a very burgeoning field. It was not well understood yet. The following three chapters focus on the women doctors in and beyond the Japanese Empire in Taiwan, Korea, and China. In Chapter 5, Ha Ying-ho writes about the growing popularity of studying medicine in Japan among Chinese women in the 1920s. Ho translates one journal and two newspaper articles by Zhang Xueqing, who received a medical education in Japan. On the one hand, Zhang was very successful in her research career in Japan. She even published a co-authored article with a Japanese colleague, but she was forced to return to China after tensions grew between the two countries. And there she found that her connection with Japan actually made it difficult to find work in public institutions. In Chapter 6, Sonia Kim demonstrates the hardships that Korean women doctors faced to gain recognition. Despite the increasing opportunities for women's medical education in colonial Korea, women doctors still lacked status relative to their male counterparts. So Kim translates a fascinating roundtable discussion among Korean women doctors, which highlights the discrimination they experienced from the Japanese and also expresses their dissatisfaction with the low status of women doctors in Korea. On the other hand, in Chapter 7, Wei Ti-Chen argues that Taiwanese female doctors were more recognized than their Japanese and Korean counterparts. She argues that this was related to the delayed emergence of the female medical profession in Taiwan, which did not really develop until the 1930s. By then, physicians had already risen to the top ranks of Taiwanese society, and this prompted local gentry to encourage young women in their families to pursue medicine and also continue their careers after marriage. This is well illustrated in the oral history of Xi Meng, a Japanese-trained practitioner. But we also have to note that Xi Meng was only one of a very privileged few who were wealthy and well connected enough to pursue such a career. The last three chapters deal with nurses in the Japanese Empire. Compared to the women doctors and nutritionists, nurses were more mobile and likely to be sent to the peripheries of the empire. In Chapter 8, Reo Tarari first analyzes the feminization of caregivers in modern Japan. Then she argues that nurses in Japan were closely associated with the military, and they were often sent to the war fronts. The translation in this chapter is taken from a memoir of Fujimura Chiyo, who served as a Japanese military nurse in Nanjing from 1939 through to 1941. As a young nurse, she witnessed the dreadfulness of war there, which is vividly depicted in the memoir. In Chapter 9, Asako Masabuchi outlines a similar story for the young nurses in Okinawa who served in the military, having received only minimal nursing training. Like Fujimura's memoir, Gushiyai's recollection also show the atrocity of war, as well as her deep regret of her powerlessness to protect her fellow citizens in the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. In the final chapter, Hiro Fujimoto offers a different perspective on the challenges for nurses in the northern peripheries of the empire in Hokkaido. Fujimoto outlines the visiting nurse program, which recruited young women from villages where there was no doctor, educated them in nursing briefly, and sent them back to their hometowns as nurses. He translates a selection of diary entries by these visiting nurses who often encountered a very harsh physical environment, a severe lack of resources, and also a lack of trust from the locals. So I hope this gives you a little taste of the variety of the chapters, the interesting stories that they tell. The accounts are sometimes very moving, sometimes funny, sometimes shocking. And it was a privilege to be involved in this project that helps to bring the forgotten voices of medical women to light. And I hope that readers will enjoy these accounts as much as we have. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. Now you have a good grasp of what the structure of the book looks like. We will come back to it in a few moments during the discussion. I would like to give now the word to Amelia Bonia to present her thoughts and comments and remarks about the edited volume.
Thank you very much, Adrian. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very happy to join this event to discuss medical women in the Japanese Empire. It is a wonderful book that I enjoyed reading and I learned a lot from. And given the platform on which we are meeting, I would also like to thank Adrian for facilitating this conversation. As you've heard, it takes place only 2 months after we discussed the volume on women in science, engineering, and medicine in the 20th century. I co-edited with Irina Anastasia Matei. And I'm really grateful for the willingness to foster debate on the history and historiography of women in STEM, especially at a time when such debate is clearly needed. Medical Women in the Japanese Empire is a wonderfully diverse book, and I mean this both with regard to its format and content. As you've heard, there is this combination of primary sources translated into English from Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, published alongside essays that I think do a great job of contextualizing both the source and its author or authors, as the case may be. So in that sense, this volume is a very useful teaching resource that can be easily incorporated into a range of courses. For example, on the history of East Asia or global and imperial history. I'm not sure to what extent we are still teaching that course. Or the history of science, technology, and medicine, and gender history. It's also an impressive volume on account of the wide range of topics and perspectives it incorporates. And in what follows, I would like to tease out some points that have spoken to me as someone with an interest in the history of women in STEM and a background in Asian area studies who has conducted research both on Japan and colonial South Asia. And in fact, while I was reading this book, I often found myself thinking about the parallels or differences, between Japanese imperialism in China and Korea, for example, with regards to medical education, and British imperialism in South Asia. And I think this book should also appeal to students of trans-imperial history in that respect, right? And in fact, the first thing that caught my eye while reading was the, I think, very conscious decision to emphasize that nation building and empire building went hand in hand during the period discussed here. I've been reading scholarship on Japanese history for a long time now, but I don't know that many books in which these two concepts are so often mentioned together. For example, when talking about Japan's history of nation and empire building, to drive home the point that these two projects were interconnected. So it's very difficult to separate them. And this argument really speaks to me because it's something I have been emphasizing in both research and teaching. For example, when I teach about scientific expeditions to German East Africa, which were similarly meant to build both the German nation and the German empire. Right? And I really appreciated the fact that that point came out so strongly in the book. Secondly, I think this volume does a great job of expanding our understanding of the many sites where women have contributed to knowledge making historically. So the decision to talk about medical women was inspired. It's a very effective umbrella term that brings together stories with a wide range of protagonists, as you've heard already, from midwives to doctors to nutritionists, but also, military nurses or development doctors and midwives in Hokkaido, right? And so this approach makes it possible to offer new perspectives on topics that have received attention before, such as that of female doctors, but also to discuss topics that have been relatively ignored, such as that of nutritionists and development doctors and midwives working in Hokkaido. And I had many naruhodo, or indeed moments, while I was reading the chapters. So for example, when I read the chapter on nutritionists, because I knew that nutritionists had been important in factories and schools in Japan for a long time, but it hadn't occurred to me to think of them within a medical framework, right? So that's something that I really appreciated when I read. So I guess my first question is about historical actors, more specifically women engaged in medical research. And there were women working in laboratories, in other fields during the first half of the 20th century, as we know, people like Yasui Kono in biology/cytology, right, or Yuasa Toshiko in physics, right? But we don't see that many women in medical research. So I thought maybe for the benefit of our audience as well, we could engage with that question as well. Why is that so, right? Why don't we find more women in medical research during this? What happened to them? And the next point I wanted to mention is about the archives of women in STEM. I think Aya-san already talked about it. The sources we used to write these histories, it's an old discussion familiar to those of us with an interest in the field, because one of the biggest obstacles when trying to document the histories of women in STEM is the lack of sources. So I guess my second question relates to exactly to this point, whether this might be less of a problem when we write about medical women than when we write about women in other scientific or technical fields. What is the situation in East Asia? Do we have more sources when we want to write about women in medicine as compared, for example, to women in science and technology? And the book is, again, wonderfully diverse in this regard because, the discussion draws on a range of sources such as periodicals, memoirs, autobiographies, and oral history interviews. And I wanted to say more about oral history interviews because it's a very useful tool for historians of women in STEM, especially when the archives are missing and we need to build them from scratch. But what I found interesting in this particular context, and I think should be emphasized, is that oral history as a methodology for documenting women's histories has quite a long pedigree. And scholars of Japan will be familiar with Kyuji Shimonroku, or the collection of interviews with former Bakufu officials from the 1890s, right? That also included 2 interviews with women of the Oku, so the secluded women's quarters in the Edo Castle, right? That were published in the Journal of the Historical Association of Japan. But then in this volume, we have that brilliant interview with Korean women physicians from the 1930s, published in Shin Gajon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, or New Family. So this was a magazine for women, right? So there's clearly a longer history of thinking about how to document women's histories. And as I was reading through this primary material, it was very interesting to reflect on the reasons why women thought it was important to record, to create a record of their lives such a long time ago. And Ogino Ginko, for example, the pioneer medical doctor in Japan, wrote at the end of the 19th century, I completed my studies in 1879, the 12th year of Meiji. Oh, how pitiful my experience was at the time. Now I should write it down, but something prevents me from doing so. I should not avoid it. However, in the hope that in 100 years' time, when the foundation stones are covered with smooth green moss, someone will sympathize with me. And then we have the passage a century later, the 1980s, about the district nurses in Okinawa, which offers an interesting parallel. We must thank Miss Irei for calling upon everyone to write about pre-war public health nurses before she died. Thanks to her words, we were able to compile this book, right? So we get, what we get from this is this strong sense that women understood how important it was to record their experiences and share them with the next generations, especially because, as this book also shows, history is not a linear progression towards, gender equality, greater gender equality, and social justice. And we saw this in the 20th century when, tragically, wars created opportunities for women to enter medical, scientific, and technical fields in greater numbers. And then, later on, the gates closed again, right, in many cases. And we are seeing this now when some of the problems we regarded as solved have returned to stare us in the face once again. And so what struck me over and over again while reading this book were the many ways in which medical women, the medical women discussed here, tried to subvert the powers that be. For example, through the connections they forged with each other, by voicing their anger or by laughing at the absurdity of it all. And again, that interview with the Korean women physicians was fascinating in that regard. For example, when they were saying that this makes me so mad, the way they expressed openly their emotions. It's an interview from the 1930s again, right? So I guess my final question would be exactly this. Why was it important for you to write this book? And what challenges have you encountered in this process? And how did you overcome them? And with this, I thank you very much for allowing me to join this conversation. Thank you again.
There's no particular order in which you can answer, so whoever would like to intervene first and address the questions which Amelia very nicely addressed. Thank you.
So maybe I can start, especially with the first question, maybe. So thank you so much, Amelia-san, for your wonderful comment. So first of all, it was a very nice that our edited volumes are published at a very similar timing. So it's your edited volume looks at women scientists in the global context. We focused on Japan, but still we have many overlaps. So I think viewers of this YouTube will enjoy both of our books if they read together. So thank you so much. And so first question, so thank you for your wonderful questions. And I think time is limited, so I just respond to the first point, which is about more how medical women engaged in research. So basically I can say I can only say about women doctors and research. But basically, so in Akane Meguro's chapter, she discussed Yoshioka Yayoi founded Tokyo Women's Medical School in 1900, and after that, the number of women doctors constantly increased. But the thing is, Yoshioka Yayoi did not care about research by women physicians, although there is some research by women doctors. Basically, Yoshioka raised women doctors for daily practice for the health of the population, not for scientific purpose. And the also normally, like if doctors want to be like professors and do research, they were supposed to go to Germany or other European countries for further study. But Yoshioka did not encourage her students to go abroad, because of course going abroad makes like women have, pursue more extra time, which can delay the time of marriage. So Yoshioka basically encourages marriage, right? So in that sense, for Yoshioka, like it was not so important for like women doctors to do some research. So as a result, in many cases, like Yoshioka's, medical professors at Yoshioka's medical school were only dominated by male professors and male medical scientists. And there were 2 more medical colleges for women, and the professor there were also occupied by male medical scientists. So I think in that sense, like the thing is, in conclusion, like Yoshioka cared about the number of medical practitioners, female medical practitioners, but she did not care about like female medical scientists. So I think that makes a difference between like a female scientist in botany or in biology, and like a female scientist in medicine. So I think I just stop here, and I don't know, who wants to?
Maybe shall I talk about the challenges, and then Aya, you can talk about science. And yeah, so you asked what challenges did we overcome, and that's a really interesting question. And one of the challenges that I think of is the challenge of the languages. And so it was a wonderful thing to have a team of people who were able to cope with those different languages and access materials that perhaps an individual scholar would not be able to access. And we also workshop them. I know in my own case, the language that Ogino Ginko writes in is extremely difficult. And and so I received a lot of help, particularly from Hiro, to be able to understand those materials and render them into something sort of like English. Yeah. So going forward, I would also be interested in similar projects where we could pool our skills and our resources to overcome some of those challenges.
Okay, yeah. So no, it was challenging, but it was fun at the same time, wasn't it? I mean, I thought it was, really like this translation project, and this whole project was very collaborative, and I really enjoyed that aspect. I think I want to actually respond to your third question about oral history interviews as a method, and I think it's a really important point to mention, and thanks for bringing this up. And I think we have to be, I think for historians, focusing on of medicine, but healthcare focusing on women as actors. We really need to be creative, with the sources, and precisely because of the fragmented nature, and I think it's true that oral history interviews is has been established, but I think we might have to actually check whether this was, associated with certain like groups of women, and not necessarily like, medical women who are much more grounded with, everyday practical work. So I think, so but I might be wrong. And that actually, your comment actually prompted me to think about, you know, or kind of like reminded me of this. You know, some of the midwives. So midwifery journal. I once had a look at the entire journal. There's one that lasts, you know, from 1890s to 1940s, and I had a look at, you know, every individual issues. And I remember at the end of it, they were, you know, many of them are clinical cases, you know, and didactic, you know, kind of articles by doctors for midwives. But towards the end, they're always like letters to each other, and also at the time I didn't really you know, see the value of it, but like waka, you know, poems. So, you know, obviously writing those things were, you know, were really important, you know, must have been important to them, you know. And I think so your comment actually, you know, really made me think, yeah, we need to take these kind of like artistic works seriously as much as you know, these clinical cases, which I've been always kind of concentrating. So yeah, thank you so much. So that's my comment or response. Yeah. And about, I think, women history of you know, women in science and technology. I think we have miles. You know, we still have lots to do. You know, Kenji Ito, for instance, has started to do, and but yeah. So.
Thank you very much for your kind responses. I would like to also address some questions and some reflections, because there is a reason why we accepted your invitation and the discussion. It's one very interesting book that walks and reveals, and there are a lot of stakes on a deeper level about the knowledge production and knowledge dissemination at the end of the day. And it's embedded in so many layers, and it's in a way very much connected with the previous discussion that we had, but as well there are some nuances. And here, reading the text, I would like to put an emphasis on the notion of subjectivity at the end, because that's some crucial component which somehow needs to be named, and I would like to unfold it in several parts. On one hand, to build on Ellen's very clear point, there are challenges, right? I mean, we can, for sure, translation, selection, appropriation of sources, reflection, and here on a more conceptual level, I would like to ask and to invite you to reflect and provide your thoughts. How does this selection of primary sources function? Because there will be always a sort of exclusion and inclusion. We need to also take into account that many of the documents were created in a specific context, right? And many of there is a very specific area. They can be found, but again, we need to dig deeper. Who they produced, and so on. And again, another challenge, which naturally, but still needs, I guess, to be named, the translation, which again, for this needs to be congratulated and to mention this. So the whole work is for our audience. We need to take into account the primary sources which are included, but also the reflection, which again, it doubles the work, right, as an editor for a volume. And this moves me to the second point, which somehow I would like to link back to Aya's title or subtitle of the chapter, which is called "Layers of Translation," which something that's the key point of the whole book. And if I would associate the edited volume, somehow I would associate with this title or with this concept, because there are many layers, and it's like in the concept of subjectivity, right? And translation for me, I don't mean in the literally sense, but I would associate with knowledge production. And that's all the layers of knowledge production. And again, I would be curious and to provoke a bit, how did the editorial process went along? Were there any places of negotiation with the publishing house in that regard? How did you adapt it for an English audience? Would that be different for a Japanese audience? To what extent these texts are canonical or not? Again, and then I have more punctual questions, and that's more about the context. One is related to modernization, because throughout the 20th century, medicine met a high degree of professionalization, and again doubled by the modernization of Japan. And in that regard, how did the professionalization of medicine went along and affected the career of women? How was this? How were these vectors going along or against? And again, as previously discussed, the process of empire building is a clear component in your work, and it's explicit and it maps very well the nuances, which again it's something important to mention. There are nuances between Taiwan, Korea, and so on, which is clearly Ellen mentioned. How does this process of empire building affect the lives, the works of the many colonies from the peripheries, and what was their strategies to survive? And again, let's think about the context of production of the document that you unfold. How did this document arrive to us at now in this moment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your wonderful comments and questions. And of course, the time is limited, so I can just briefly touch on a few points you raised. And especially I want to engage with the point, which is more like translation issues, as well as editorial things. So first of all, maybe I can start with the editorial issues, because, as I mentioned in my presentation, this is, completed the first time for me to do edited volume in English. And I wrote several articles in English, but the, edited volume or book is, quite different, right? And but of course, and when we submit our book proposal to publishers, mainly like Ellen was taking care of that. And we end up, we found a very nice editor from Routledge, and she was very encouraging to include East Asian scholarship. And so I think in that sense, we are lucky. Our editor is very, she is very, she's trying to promote like Japanese history, which is done by like Asia-based scholars. And I was actually in Japan when I started this project. I was in Kyoto, so in that sense, the editor at Routledge helps us a lot. And also, I wanted to include translation because this is a more like Japanese like scholarly tradition or academic tradition. We often translate like non-Japanese secondary sources into English, into Japanese, as well as non-Japanese primary sources into Japanese. Of course, today, this type of translation works are not considered important, but still we appreciate such a such an effort. And I was also thought that when I was teaching Japanese history in English, as a historian, I wanted to assign some like historical documents, but students, like undergrad students, do not read Japanese. So I just wanted to assign some like historical documents. But the thing is, most like English English primary sources are more like sort of one-sided, like medical doctors from America who observe Japanese medicine, whatever. So I just wanted to offer some like alternative view into primary sources. And I think one of the good parts of our book is we included primary sources not only in Japanese but also in Chinese and Korean, which also benefited me because I do not read Chinese and Korean text. Maybe some other people like I don't know, Korean scholars who are working on like this topic, maybe they do not read Chinese text, but they can read that in English, right? So in that sense, this type of like translating several languages into one language is very beneficial and helpful for readers. So maybe I stop here and pass it over to.
Okay, so then I'll step in. I remember there was in fact, a type of book discussion where actually all of us were there and in Japanese, that was conducted in Japanese, and it's been in fact suggested that maybe we should we should think about like producing a Japanese kind of Japanese language version of this source book, and of course the audience is going to be, I mean, the readership is going to be very, very different. So I think for me, the challenge is, translation, as you suggested, Adrian. I think the translation was not just translating the language, right? In our project. So in many cases, it was about translating different academic writing conventions. Because some of them, as Hiro mentioned, we chose scholars who are based in different parts of the world and who come from different academic traditions. So we've got several, we've got 3 languages, but also very different conventions, and I think so in the end, of course, we had to kind of make this, unfortunately homogeneous for, to make it into an English language edited volume. So in this case, sometimes these kind of maybe might have, this was a struggle. I have to say, I think, with some, in some cases, but then again, everybody worked so hard, and I think the process was, it was hard, but with the collective effort, we overcame it somehow. But I mean, I don't think we can please anybody. I think to make there is a English language convention, right, of how argumentation works, structure works, and unfortunately, this was a decision we made, to publish it into English to make it most accessible, because it is unfortunately English is a global academic language at the moment. So but thank you for pointing out, and this is a really important important point, and issue we kind of like wrestled throughout the process. So Ellen, I don't know if you want to step in, but
I just wanted to add something about the inclusion and exclusion of sources. the selection of sources from our perspective was quite democratic in that each author brought their own text to the book, choosing their own translations and selections and so on. But of course, we are limited by what we have available to us. We are limited by what we can actually read, what will fit in the book, and so on. So we can't pretend to be comprehensive in that sense. But I think that's kind of helped to add to the variety of the voices that we were able to choose.
Dear listeners, this brings our conversation to a close. Continuing the line of thought and discussion and inquiry we opened in December, the book by the book Negotiating Invisibility, we saw today that knowledge and knowledge production it plays an important role in producing historical knowledge. Now, Hiro started by pinpointing 3 main points through which show the editorial engagement and the process of creation of selecting the sources. Then Aya Homei emphasized that the inequality of today in Japan, as stated in the introduction, is not accidental. Her 3 claims are that the book challenges the focus on male experts, in which we can see a strong connection with the book published by Amelia and Irina. Then the women medical history might seem invisible if we don't check accurately through the archives, but the documents are there, and again, unfolding these documents is important. And then again, here leads to her last point, what Ellen emphasized a bit later on was about that Japanese empire was unfolding different, and the notion of medical women was perceived different in Okinawa, Korea, and Taiwan, as the future readers will see it in the specific chapters. Ellen explained the chronology and the structure of the book. So it starts in 1866 and it ends around 1940. In the 1940s, the sources are extremely interesting ones. And here we discussed and developed a bit around the notion of subjectivity. So you can find oral interviews, diaries, books again, and prescribed manuals, so to say. And there is here there was a very important point to pinpoint that intersectionality speaks for itself in multiple layers, right? On one hand, throughout the documents themselves, in which we can see how this very complicated issue was unfolding, but as well throughout the academic interpretation. And taken together, these contributions reveal the subtleties about knowledge formation, about knowledge dissemination, and gender aspect by taking the case of medical women in Japan. And Revdem would like to thank our guests for joining us today. Hiro Fujimoto, Aya Homei, Ellen Nakamura, and Amelia Bonia. Dear listeners, on this note, we would like to thank you and keep in touch and stay connected for the future episodes.